He might not look like a stereotypical activist, but Harold Murphy is part of a global revolution. The 58-year-old is one of a small but rapidly growing number of motorists driving an electric vehicle, or EV. It's not a decision he regrets.
It's great. Look, I got the slowest version you can get, and it does 0 to 100 in 5 seconds. So, that sort of tells you everything you need to know about the car. It's just an amazing machine.
Less than 2% of new car sales in Australia in 2021 were electric, but this is expected to surge in coming years. Harold Murphy, a semi-retired IT professional, likens the change to another technological revolution.
It's a little bit like everyone had a conventional mobile phone, say like a Nokia, and we all loved them, we thought they were great. And then Apple came out with this strange, flat-screened, no tactile feedback smartphone. And for a while, a lot of people sort of looked at it and went, well, that's not really for me. But look, 13 years later, everyone's got one. And that's exactly what's going to happen with EVs.
The uptake of EVs around the world is driving another type of boom in the minerals used to make the cars. Happily for Australia, all of those minerals are found here, fuelling hopes the country can become an EV mineral superpower.
Is very uniquely positioned in this space. No other country has the same resources that Australia has. No other country has the same amount of production that we have. We really are a minerals powerhouse.
Questions about which minerals will drive the EV revolution and the extent to which Australia will power the switch are increasingly occupying the minds of mining bosses. They gathered in Kalgoorlie for the annual Diggers and Dealers Conference, the biggest of its kind in Australia. From exploration minnows to the world's biggest diversified miner, BHP, everyone wants a piece of the action. Experts say the jostling for position is understandable.
We're really lucky in Australia. We have the most amazing natural endowment of all of these battery minerals. In fact, when it comes to world rankings, we're in the top 10 for all of them. And for most of them, we're even in the top 3. So absolutely extraordinary geological endowment combined with an ongoing geological potential for marvellous new discoveries.
Lithium is the best known of the EV minerals, but there's a slew of other materials required to produce modern-day high-performance batteries. At the Murrin mine in Western Australia's northern goldfields, mining giant Glencore is producing 2 of them, nickel and cobalt. Its production of cobalt alone accounts for about 5% of global supply.
I think Murrin is very central to the EV story. And not only is it Australia's largest cobalt producer, but the nickel that Murrin produces, the 40,000 tonnes a year, is also highly sought after by the market because, of course, the batteries contain not only cobalt but also nickel.
Along with nickel and cobalt, Glencore also generates copper and zinc from its Australian operations. The Anglo-Swiss company sees big opportunities for growth.
By 2050, we see demand for nickel and cobalt quadrupling from today. And we also see the need for supply of copper and zinc to double by 2050. So basically we see a strong demand for all of those minerals into the future.
Then there are rare earths, which are also used in the construction of electric vehicles.
You might have a couple of kilos in an ICE vehicle. In a really optioned up electric vehicle, you might have 4 to 5 kilos of rare earths in that vehicle.
To meet the growing demand from buyers, including the auto industry, Lynas Corporation is spending about $1 billion on expansion projects in Australia. One is a $500 million upgrade of its Mount Weld rare earths mine in the northern goldfields. It's also building a new processing plant in Kalgoorlie at a similar cost. The facility will help Lynas store waste from its Malaysian processing operation for possible repurposing into fertiliser. It'll also boost production and set the company on a more ambitious footing.
Depending upon the ongoing licence conditions for our operation in Malaysia, it will be to a greater or lesser extent growth versus replacement capital. Either way, it's an important part as we continue to develop the company.
This region of the goldfields was one of Australia's original mining hotspots. Now, minerals from around here, including nickel, lithium and cobalt, are once again in high demand, and this time it's for a completely different reason: the decarbonisation of transport.
There are various forecasts for how fast the market's going to grow. In the industry, we typically talk about it being doubling by 2030. Some of the external commentators are throwing around numbers like 3 times or 5 times. What is certain is it is growing fast and is growing sooner than most of us forecast.
And let me tell you, after being 2.5 years in development...
It's an assessment that's widely backed. Across Australia, but particularly in the traditional mining powerhouse of Western Australia, miners are spending big to meet growing demand. They say the emergence of the EV market is turning convention on its head.
To the point where you're having car manufacturers invest in mining companies. Normally, there's so many steps removed from sourcing the raw material, but there is a race on for those raw materials. You've seen Ford Motor Company, for instance, invest into Liontown and provide debt financing for a lithium development company. You would never see Ford investing in mining companies before. So there's been a real learning curve. So they're coming right upstream to secure those supplies. So that is a fundamental change.
Australia's reputation as a safe and politically stable jurisdiction means there's no shortage of investor cash looking to develop the country's new generation of mines.
Because we're one of the few listed nickel players, we do get a lot of inbound interest to invest in nickel, and so we've got a pretty strong shareholder base. So there is finance available for good projects, but there's definitely a far greater ESG lens put to that.
Despite the wealth of EV resources, industry insiders worry about Australia's ability to capitalise on the opportunity. Supply of key ingredient lithium is already well behind demand, and there are concerns Australia may be too slow to bring on the new mines required. What's more, experts say Australia mustn't miss out on adding value to the raw materials, arguing the real prize is in making batteries and their components.
We think that time is running out for Australia to play a leading role in the battery value chain. By 2030, we expect there to be a lot of consolidation in the industry from international countries that are looking to capture this value for themselves. And it really is a race. Australia needs to move fast and move decisively to capture this value in the industry.
Others agree.
We have enormous mineral endowment and the ongoing geological potential for marvellous new discoveries. We have some companies taking the next step down the supply chain and value adding by making battery precursor chemicals. And then we have this tantalising potential to develop our own domestic EV battery manufacturing sector right here in Australia in the coming years.
That will increase production and improve sustainability.
Miners themselves are more optimistic, but they acknowledge that labour shortages and Australia's tougher environmental hurdles are a challenge.
In terms of costs, absolutely, particularly logistics costs internationally have more than doubled through the pandemic. There are probably the most significant issues are where things are not predictable. And so shipping our concentrate from Fremantle to Malaysia, for example, generally takes about 14 days. And through the pandemic, it took up to, at its worst, about 54 days. But it was not predictable. And so that makes it difficult to manage that.
The country's top geology advisor says Australia is in pole position to succeed in the EV mineral race. But whether it can become more than a primary producer of the materials is an open question.
If you want to compare an EV battery to cooking, we have all of the ingredients to make a delicious cake in our pantry. And the challenge for Australia, the question that we need to be asking ourselves right now is, do we want to continue doing what we have been doing? Do we want to continue selling some of those ingredients to cake makers overseas? Or do we want to take that next step? Do we want to maybe make the cake batter here in Australia and then send it out for cooking? Or do we want to go the whole hog and invest in a new oven and make and bake the cake ourselves right here in Australia? So that's where we are with the battery situation right now.
Regardless of where the minerals are mined, consumer Harold Murphy reckons the switch to EVs will be inevitable. He says advantages of EVs over cars powered by fossil fuels are huge and go far beyond the environmental benefits of fewer emissions.
It is true that, we're at currently 2% market penetration, but there's a point of inflection. You can see it now. You can't drive very far on any sort of road trip and not see an EV on the road, whereas a couple of years ago, they were extremely rare. People's acceptance has just completely changed.